On a quiet morning in a small, tightly knit town, the courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with nervous whispers and shuffling papers as the community gathered to witness a trial that had already sparked heated debates. Everyone knew the story, or at least they thought they did. A young black boy, no more than 15, stood accused of a crime that, if proven, could alter his life forever. His name was Jamal, and though his slender frame made him appear small, there was a quiet strength in his eyes that didn't match his years. Jamal's mother, a woman with worry lines etched deeply into her face, sat in the front row, clutching a tissue in one hand and a small cross in the other. Beside her, Jamal's lawyer, a seasoned but weary man named Mr. Carter, flipped through his notes, preparing for the moment when all eyes would be on them. Across the room, the prosecuting attorney stood with a demeanor so sharp it could cut glass, her arguments seemingly ironclad. She had evidence, witnesses, and a strong conviction that this boy was guilty. The judge, a man with a stoic expression and years of experience, sat at the bench, observing the room. His gavel rested beside him, a symbol of authority and the weight of justice. Yet, for all his calm, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different. Something about Jamal didn't fit the narrative being spun, but facts were facts, or so it seemed. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out a story designed to seal Jamal's fate. Witnesses recounted events that painted him as reckless, as someone capable of harm. Evidence was presented with precision, each piece adding another layer of doubt to Jamal's character. The jury, a mix of faces from different walks of life, listened intently, their expressions unreadable. But Jamal? He sat there quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze unwavering. He had barely spoken since the day of his arrest, and this silence had become a point of contention. Some saw it as a sign of guilt, while others believed it was a young boy overwhelmed by a system too vast and complex to fight against. When the time came for Jamal to take the stand, the room fell into an almost eerie silence. Every creak of a bench and every shuffle of feet seemed amplified as he walked slowly to the witness stand. His movements were deliberate, his head held high. There was no trembling, no hesitation. He sat down, placed his hands on the edge of the wooden barrier, and looked out at the sea of faces watching him. The judge leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. The prosecuting attorney smirked, already anticipating the cracks she could expose in his story. But Jamal's mother, sitting in the gallery, whispered a silent prayer. The first few questions were routine, designed to set the stage. "State your name for the court," the prosecutor began, her tone clipped. "Jamal Harris," he replied, his voice steady. "And your age?" she continued. 15, he answered, his gaze unwavering. The questions went on, and Jamal's answers were concise. He didn't stumble, didn't falter. But as the line of questioning turned more pointed, the tension in the room thickened. The prosecutor pushed harder, her words sharp and calculated. She wanted him to slip, to say something that could be used against him. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The prosecutor leaned in, her voice dropping just slightly as she asked the question that would decide everything. "Why should this court believe you didn't do it, Jamal? What do you have to say for yourself?" For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that stretched out endlessly, wrapping itself around every person in the room. Jamal looked down at his hands, his fingers lightly tracing the grain of the wood before him. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting the judge's. He took a deep breath, and the words that came out next were so unexpected, so profoundly simple, that they seemed to echo in the stillness of the courtroom. 2 words, that's all he said. And in an instant, the judge's face went pale. The courtroom froze as if time itself had stopped. All eyes were locked on Jamal, his words hanging in the air like an unspoken truth that everyone could feel, but no one could quite grasp. Even the prosecutor, usually quick on her feet, paused for a beat longer than she intended. The judge, who had spent decades presiding over cases like this, sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his pale complexion betraying the impact of those 2 words. Jamal didn't flinch under the weight of the collective gaze. If anything, he seemed calmer, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders the moment he spoke. His mother, seated just a few feet behind him, clutched the cross around her neck so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't know what those words meant. No one did, but she could feel something shift in the room. A change in the air, subtle but undeniable. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "We'll take a short recess," he announced, his voice faltering slightly. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room erupted into murmurs. People leaned toward one another, whispering questions and theories, their curiosity stoked by the boy who had dared to say so little yet conveyed so much. Jamal was escorted back to his seat, his face unreadable. Mr. Carter leaned in, speaking to him in a hushed tone, but Jamal only nodded. His mother reached out to touch his shoulder as he walked past, but he didn't stop, didn't acknowledge her touch. It wasn't out of disrespect. Jamal loved his mother more than anything in the world, but he knew that if he looked at her now, he might lose the resolve he had fought so hard to maintain. Outside the courtroom, the scene was no less chaotic. Reporters with notepads and cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, speculating wildly about what had just happened inside. This case had already drawn attention, not just because of its nature, but because of what it represented. In a town like this, small, divided in ways that people didn't always talk about out loud, a case like Jamal's wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about everything: race, power, justice, and who got to define the truth. As the minutes ticked by, the courtroom began to fill again. People returned to their seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The recess had done little to cool the tension. If anything, it had only heightened it. The judge returned to the bench, his demeanor carefully neutral but his movements just a touch more deliberate than before. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice steady now. He glanced at Jamal, then at the prosecutor, as if weighing something in his mind. "Counsel, you may continue." The prosecutor rose from her seat, her confidence visibly shaken but not broken. She was good at what she did, and she wasn't about to let 2 words derail her case. Approaching the witness stand, she adjusted her tone, making it softer, almost motherly. "Jamal," she began, her voice laced with a feigned warmth that was more unnerving than comforting. "I want you to help us understand. Those 2 words you just said, they've certainly gotten everyone's attention, but they don't tell us much, do they? Can you elaborate? Can you explain to the court what you mean?" Jamal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her with the same steady gaze he had maintained since the beginning. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, something that made people uncomfortable because they couldn't quite name it. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "I don't need to explain," he said. "The truth doesn't need more words." The courtroom erupted again, this time louder than before. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. "Quiet," he barked, his usual calm giving way to a rare display of frustration. Slowly, the room settled, though the tension was now so thick it felt like it might burst. The prosecutor took a deep breath, regaining her composure. "Jamal, I understand you might feel overwhelmed, but this court operates on evidence, on facts. Without explanation, your words mean nothing." Jamal tilted his head slightly, as if considering her statement. "You already have the facts," he said. "You just don't want to see them." The prosecutor opened her mouth to respond, but she hesitated. For the first time, she felt as though she was on the back foot, as though this boy, this child, was controlling the narrative. She glanced at the judge, who met her gaze with a subtle but unmistakable look that seemed to say, "Proceed carefully, asterisk." The prosecutor turned back to Jamal, her voice losing some of its sharpness. "If you believe we have all the facts, then help us see them. Tell us your side of the story." Jamal hesitated for the first time. His calm exterior faltered, just slightly, and for a brief moment, he looked like what he truly was, a scared 15-year-old boy. But then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and spoke. "My side doesn't matter," he said quietly, because no one was listening from the start. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. They weren't loud or dramatic, but they carried a weight that settled over everyone present. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the bench. The prosecutor took a step back, her expression unreadable. And in the gallery, Jamal's mother let out a soft gasp, tears streaming down her face. The judge called for another recess, this time without explanation. The courtroom emptied out again, but the whispers didn't stop. Outside, reporters scrambled to piece together a narrative, their headlines practically writing themselves. Inside, Jamal sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Mr. Carter leaned in once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jamal," he said, his tone a mixture of frustration and desperation. "You're not making this any easier. If you have something to say, you need to say it. Otherwise, they'll decide for you." Jamal looked at him, his eyes steady but tired. "They've already decided," he said. "I just need to show them why they're wrong." Mr. Carter sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You're playing a dangerous game, kid. This isn't some school debate. This is your life." Jamal didn't respond. Instead, he turned to look at his mother, who had been silently praying since the trial began. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and pride. Jamal gave her a small nod, as if to say, "I know what I'm doing, asterisk." When the court reconvened, all eyes were once again on Jamal. The judge looked at him, his expression softer than before. "Jamal," he said, his voice almost gentle, "you've been given a chance to speak. Use it wisely." Jamal stood, his movements deliberate. He turned to face the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the jurors, the spectators, and finally, the judge. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "You all think you know me," he said. "You think you know what happened, and you think you know the kind of person I am. But you don't, and that's okay, because the truth doesn't need me to defend it. It just needs you to open your eyes." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. And for the first time since the trial began, it felt like the truth was finally starting to emerge, not through evidence or arguments, but through the quiet, unshakable conviction of a boy who refused to be silenced. The silence in the courtroom felt alive, almost tangible, as if every person present was holding their breath at once. Jamal's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone, challenging them to look beyond their assumptions. The judge sat back, his face carefully neutral, but his fingers drummed lightly against the edge of his bench, a rare, unconscious sign of unease. The prosecutor glanced toward the jury, her composure starting to crack as she noticed a few faces softening, their stern expressions shifting to something more uncertain. Jamal's mother wiped at her tears, a mixture of hope and fear battling within her. She had raised her son to stand tall in the face of injustice, to speak the truth even when the odds were against him. But watching him now, surrounded by so many who had already made up their minds, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about proving that a system designed to protect could also destroy when wielded unfairly. The judge cleared his throat, his voice breaking through the tension like a distant thunderclap. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to redirect?" His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency, as if he, too, was searching for something, an explanation, a way forward, anything to bring clarity to the tangled emotions swirling in the room. Mr. Carter rose slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the witness stand. He wasn't a man prone to theatrics, but even he could feel the enormity of what had just unfolded. He studied Jamal for a moment, as though trying to understand the boy who had managed to shift the atmosphere with just a few sentences. "Jamal," he began, his voice steady but gentle, "I've been your attorney for months now. I've heard your story, seen the evidence, and stood by you every step of the way. But the people in this courtroom haven't. They don't know what I know, and if you don't speak up, they may never understand. So, for your sake, for your mother's sake, help them see what you see." Jamal looked at Mr. Carter, his expression unreadable. Then he glanced toward his mother, her tear-streaked face a silent plea. Slowly, he exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a mountain. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge of defiance. "You want me to tell them my side," he said, his eyes locking with Mr. Carter's. "But what difference will it make? They've already decided who I am. They've decided I'm guilty because I'm black, because I come from a part of town they don't trust, because it's easier to believe I did it than to question the story they've been told." His words sent a ripple through the room. The jury shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unable to look away. Even the prosecutor, who had spent her career in tough cases, seemed momentarily at a loss. She opened her mouth as if to object, but quickly closed it, realizing there was nothing she could say without seeming callous. Jamal continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "The night they said I did it, I wasn't even there. I was at home, doing homework. My mom was in the next room. But none of that matters, does it? Because someone said they saw me, and that's all it took for them to put me in handcuffs." Mr. Carter stepped closer, his voice softening. "Jamal, the court needs specifics. Can you tell us what happened that night? Can you explain why someone might have said they saw you when you weren't there?" Jamal hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because people like me don't get the benefit of the doubt," he said finally. "Because it's easier to point a finger at someone who looks like me than to admit you don't really know what happened." In the gallery, a man sitting near the back let out a scoff, drawing sharp glares from several others. Tensions had been simmering since the trial began, but now it felt like they might boil over at any moment. The judge raised a hand, his voice firm. "Order in the court," he said, though even he seemed to recognize how futile it was to try and contain the emotions spilling out. Meanwhile, Jamal's words seemed to have struck a nerve with the jury. A middle-aged woman in the second row, who had been stoic and unmoving since the trial began, now looked at Jamal with an expression that bordered on sympathy. A young man in the front row, who had earlier been scribbling notes, now sat with his pen frozen mid-air, his eyes fixed on the boy in the witness stand. The prosecutor finally stood, her voice slicing through the tension. "Your Honor, while this testimony is certainly compelling, it does not change the facts of this case. The evidence clearly places the defendant near the scene of the crime. Multiple witnesses have identified him. We cannot allow emotional appeals to cloud the facts." Jamal turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "You mean the same witnesses who only saw someone running in the dark? The same ones who couldn't even describe the person's face until after they saw my picture? That's your evidence?" The prosecutor's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. The judge looked at her, then back at Jamal. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice measured, "if you have any evidence to support your claims, now is the time to present it." Jamal hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't have video footage," he said finally. "I don't have a recording of me sitting at my desk that night. All I have is my word and the truth. But if that's not enough, then what's the point of any of this?" His words echoed in the room, a quiet challenge that no one seemed willing to answer. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "This court will take all evidence and testimony into consideration," he said. "But for now, we will proceed." The tension in the room remained as thick as ever, even as the trial moved on. Witnesses were called, evidence was re-examined, and arguments were made. But no matter how much was said or shown, the focus always seemed to drift back to Jamal, the boy who had managed to shake the very foundation of the court with just a few words. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtroom. The judge finally called for an adjournment, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning," he said. "Until then, this court is adjourned." The gavel came down, and the room began to empty. But even as people filed out, the tension lingered, hanging in the air like a storm cloud that refused to break. Jamal was led out of the courtroom by an officer, his mother following close behind. Mr. Carter stayed behind, gathering his notes with a look of quiet determination. Outside, the streets were alive with noise, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, onlookers debating loudly. But Jamal didn't pay any of it attention. He walked with his head held high, his eyes focused straight ahead. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as people filed back in the next morning. The tension was palpable, heavier than it had been the day before. Whispers filled the room, speculation running wild. Reporters perched on the edge of their seats, their notebooks and cameras ready to capture every twist and turn. Jamal sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his face calm but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. His mother sat just behind him, her hand resting on her Bible, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Mr. Carter leaned over to Jamal, speaking in a low voice. "Today is critical," he said, his tone urgent but reassuring. "They're going to push hard. They want to rattle you. But remember, the truth is on your side. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." Jamal nodded, his jaw tightening. He had spent the night replaying everything in his mind. Every word spoken in court, every piece of evidence presented. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew he couldn't let fear control him. This was bigger than him now. This was about standing up not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever been accused, judged, and silenced before anyone bothered to listen. When the judge entered and the court was called to order, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The prosecutor wasted no time. She rose from her seat, her expression sharp and determined, and began calling her next witnesses. Each one added to the web of accusations, their testimonies weaving a narrative that painted Jamal as guilty. A shopkeeper who claimed he saw someone matching Jamal's description running past his store. A neighbor who insisted she heard shouting near the crime scene and thought she recognized his voice. It was all circumstantial, but it was enough to cast doubt. Jamal sat still, his face unreadable as the testimonies piled up. But inside, he was boiling. How could they believe these stories when none of them were solid? None of these people really saw him. They saw someone they thought looked like him, someone who fit the image they already had in their minds. And that was enough for them. It always seemed to be enough. When the prosecutor finally sat down, satisfied she had built her case, Mr. Carter stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He approached the witness stand, his voice calm but firm, as he began to dismantle the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. To the shopkeeper, he asked, "Was the street well lit at the time you claimed to have seen someone running?" The man hesitated. "Not particularly," he admitted. "But there was enough light to see." "Enough light to see clearly?" Mr. Carter pressed. "Or enough to make assumptions about what you thought you saw?" When it was Jamal's turn to take the stand again,
uncomfortably
the
but
courtroom
didn't
fell
respond.
silent.
Everyone
Everyone was
moved
watching
on,
him,
methodically
waiting to see
poking
if the
holes
boy
in
who
each
had spoken
witness's
with such
testimony.
quiet conviction
By the time
the day
he was
before
done,
could do it
the
again.
prosecution's
Jamal
case
took
looked
a
far
deep
less
breath as he
airtight than
approached
it
the
had
stand,
at the start of
his
the
heart
day.
pounding in
But
his
even
chest.
so,
He
the
knew
weight
this
of
was
their
it.
accusations
This
still
was his
hung heavy
chance
in
to
the
make them
air,
see the truth.
a cloud of
The
doubt that
prosecutor
refused
wasted no
to
time.
dissipate.
She stood and approached him, her eyes narrowing. "Jamal," she began, her voice sharp, "you've made it clear that you believe you've been unfairly accused. But belief isn't evidence. So let me ask you this. If you weren't at the scene of the crime, why do multiple witnesses claim they saw you?" Jamal met her gaze, his voice steady. "Because they didn't see me. They saw what they wanted to see. Someone who fit their idea of who would be guilty." The prosecutor's lips tightened. "That's a convenient answer, but it doesn't explain why your fingerprints were found on the fence near the scene." Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. He had climbed that fence before, months ago, when he and his friends had been messing around in the neighborhood. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now it was being used against him. "I've been near that fence before," he admitted, "but not on the night you're talking about." The prosecutor pounced. "So you admit you've been there. How can we be sure you weren't there that night?" Jamal's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Because I told you I was at home. My mom was there. She can tell you I didn't leave the house." "And yet," the prosecutor said, her voice dripping with skepticism, "you have no other proof. No camera footage, no alibi other than your mother, who, of course, would want to protect you. Isn't that convenient?" Jamal clenched his fists under the stand, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to shout, to scream that this wasn't fair, that the truth shouldn't need to be proven over and over again just because it didn't fit their narrative. But he knew he couldn't lose his cool. That's what they wanted, for him to slip, to give them an excuse to paint him as angry, as dangerous, as exactly the person they had decided he was. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice calm, but filled with quiet defiance. "The truth doesn't need to be convenient," he said. "It just needs to be heard." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The prosecutor, caught off guard by his response, hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving on. But the moment lingered, a crack in the carefully constructed case against him. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom only grew. Mr. Carter presented evidence that poked more holes in the prosecution's case, a timeline that didn't add up, inconsistencies in witness statements, and most importantly, a lack of any concrete proof tying Jamal to the crime. But for every step forward they took, the weight of the accusations still loomed, an invisible barrier they couldn't seem to break through. By the time the judge called for the day to end, the courtroom felt like a powder keg ready to explode. People whispered in hushed tones as they filed out, their faces a mix of doubt, anger, and curiosity. Jamal sat at the defense table, his shoulders heavy but his resolve unshaken. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. As he was led out of the courtroom, the voices of reporters shouting questions followed him into the cool evening air. But he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. All he could do was focus on the day ahead, the day that could decide everything. The morning of the third day in court arrived with an air of quiet foreboding. The crowd outside the courthouse had grown larger, with protesters holding signs demanding justice, while others debated the case in heated voices. The media presence was almost overwhelming, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward anyone who looked like they might have a story to tell. But inside the courtroom, it was eerily silent. The kind of silence that only existed before something big was about to happen. Jamal sat at the defense table, his face composed but his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Mr. Carter leaned over, speaking in a low voice. "I've just been informed about something," he said, his expression unreadable. "There's a new witness. Someone who claims to have information that could change everything." Jamal's heart skipped a beat, his stomach twisting. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet," Mr. Carter admitted. "The prosecution hasn't shared much. But they're bringing them in today." Jamal felt the walls of the courtroom close in around him. A new witness? After everything they had gone through? It didn't make sense. Why now? His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of it, but no answer came. All he knew was that this could either save him or destroy him. When court was called to order, the prosecutor wasted no time. She stood with a confident smile, as though she had already won. "Your Honor," she began, "the prosecution would like to call an additional witness to the stand. This individual came forward just yesterday with information that directly pertains to this case." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Why was this witness not disclosed earlier?" he asked, his tone sharp. The prosecutor straightened her jacket. "The witness only came forward recently, Your Honor. We moved as quickly as possible to bring this to the court's attention." The judge sighed but nodded. "Very well, call your witness." The doors to the courtroom opened, and a young man stepped inside. He looked nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets and his eyes darting around the room. He couldn't have been more than a couple of years older than Jamal, and there was something about him that immediately made the room sit up and take notice. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the young man. He recognized him. It was Marcus, a kid from his neighborhood, someone he had grown up with but hadn't seen in months. Marcus walked to the stand, avoiding Jamal's eyes, and took his oath. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Marcus Green," he said, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Green, can you tell the court what you know about the night in question?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Jamal for a split second before looking away. "I was there," he said finally. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, the tension skyrocketing. Jamal felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Marcus had been there. Why hadn't he come forward earlier? And what was he about to say? The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. The prosecutor continued, her voice steady. "You were there at the scene of the crime." Marcus nodded. "Yeah. And what did you see?" Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I saw someone running," he said. But it wasn't Jamal. The room went dead silent, every eye fixed on Marcus. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily stunned, though she quickly recovered. "Can you repeat that?" she asked, her voice sharp. It wasn't Jamal, Marcus said again, more firmly this time. The person I saw was taller, bigger. They were wearing a hoodie, but I could tell it wasn't him. The whisper started up again, louder this time, and the judge had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. Jamal stared at Marcus, his mind racing. Relief flooded him, but it was quickly tempered by confusion. If Marcus had seen this, why hadn't he come forward sooner? And why had the prosecution called him, knowing he would say this? The prosecutor's expression tightened. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice icy, "if you saw this, why didn't you report it immediately? Why wait until now?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't want to get involved. But when I heard Jamal was being blamed, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. He didn't do it. I know he didn't." The prosecutor pressed her lips together, clearly frustrated. "Your Honor, this testimony is highly suspect. The witness admits to withholding information until now, and we have no way to verify his claims." Mr. Carter stood, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, Marcus Green's testimony aligns with the inconsistencies we've already pointed out in the prosecution's case. The witnesses who claimed to see Jamal couldn't describe his face. The timeline doesn't add up. And now we have someone who was actually there, who saw the person responsible, and can confirm it wasn't Jamal." The rest of the day was a blur of questions and two attorneys, both sides trying to use Marcus's testimony to their advantage. He said finally, the prosecution worked to discredit him, painting him as unreliable, while Mr. Carter fought to show that his words were the missing piece of the puzzle. But through it all, one thing was clear: the stakes had never been higher. As the court adjourned for the day, Jamal sat in his chair, his mind spinning. Marcus's testimony had thrown everything into chaos, and the outcome of the trial felt more uncertain than ever. He glanced at Marcus as he left the stand, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Jamal wanted to thank him, to ask him why he had waited so long, but there was no time. Marcus was whisked away, leaving Jamal with more questions than answers. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was louder than ever, divided in their opinions. Some shouted for justice for Jamal, while others accused Marcus of lying to protect him. The media swarmed, their cameras capturing every moment, every soundbite. As Jamal walked to the waiting police car, escorted by officers, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. The trial wasn't over, and the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. Marcus's words had shaken the foundation of the case against him. And now, all he could do was hold onto that hope and prepare for whatever came next. The courtroom was electric on the final day of the trial. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation. Even the judge, usually calm and detached, seemed tense as he adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. Outside, the crowd had swelled, their voices echoing faintly through the thick walls of the courthouse. Protest signs waved in the distance, a stark reminder of how much this case had gripped the community. Jamal sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly in front of him. He glanced at Mr. Carter, who was reviewing his notes one last time. Today would decide everything. For weeks, he had been battling fear and doubt, but now, as the end approached, he felt something he hadn't expected: clarity. He had told the truth. That was all he could do. The prosecutor stood first, delivering her closing argument with precision and force. She recounted the evidence, reminding the jury of the fingerprints on the fence and the testimonies of those who claimed to have seen Jamal near the scene. She dismissed Marcus's testimony as unreliable, calling it a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. Her voice rang with confidence, but there was an edge of frustration beneath it. The cracks in her case were visible now, and everyone in the room could feel it. When it was Mr. Carter's turn, he rose slowly, his expression calm but intense. He began by addressing the jury directly, his voice steady and deliberate. He spoke of Jamal's character, of the kind-hearted boy who had never been in trouble before. He dismantled the prosecution's evidence piece by piece, pointing out the inconsistencies and the lack of concrete proof. He reminded the jury of Marcus's testimony, of how it aligned with the truth Jamal had been telling all along. Then, just as he was about to finish, Mr. Carter paused. The silence in the room was deafening as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense has one final piece of evidence to present. Something that only came to light late last night." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what Mr. Carter was talking about, and the look of surprise on the prosecutor's face suggested she didn't either. The judge frowned. "This is highly irregular," he said, "but I'll allow it. Proceed." Mr. Carter nodded and motioned to the back of the courtroom. The doors opened and a police officer walked in holding a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a cell phone. The officer handed it to Mr. Carter, who held it up for the jury to see. "This phone," he began, "was recovered by detectives combing the area near the crime scene. It was found hidden in a storm drain less than a block away. We believe it belongs to the actual perpetrator of this crime." The room erupted in whispers. The prosecutor stood, her face pale. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not disclosed during discovery." The judge held up a hand. "Overruled. I'll allow it, but proceed carefully, Mr. Carter." Mr. Carter nodded and continued. "The phone was unlocked, and its contents were reviewed by law enforcement. On it, we found messages sent just minutes before the crime took place, messages detailing the exact plan, messages that named the true suspect." Jamal's breath caught in his throat as Mr. Carter looked directly at him. And it wasn't Jamal. The whispers grew louder, and the judge had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. The prosecutor sat down, her expression unreadable, as Mr. Carter handed the evidence bag to the bailiff to be shown to the jury. But it wasn't just the phone itself that sealed the moment, it was what came next. Mr. Carter called the lead detective to the stand to verify the discovery. The detective confirmed the phone's authenticity and its contents, adding that they had already matched fingerprints on the device to another individual, a known offender with a history of similar crimes. The room was buzzing now, the tension almost unbearable. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from doubt to realization. For weeks, they had been told one story, and now, in a matter of minutes, that story was unraveling before their eyes. As the prosecution scrambled to recover, Jamal felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Relief, disbelief, anger. It all blended together. He glanced at his mother, who was clutching her Bible tightly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope filled the room. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into the hallway, where reporters swarmed anyone they could get a statement from. Jamal and his mother sat in a quiet corner, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the bailiff called everyone back inside. The jury had reached a verdict. Jamal's heart pounded as he took his seat, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The foreperson stood, holding the small piece of paper that would decide Jamal's fate. She looked at the judge, then at Jamal, her expression unreadable. "On the charge of burglary," she said, her voice steady, "we find the defendant not guilty." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by cheers from Jamal's supporters. His mother burst into tears, pulling him into a tight embrace. Jamal felt like he could finally breathe again. The weight he had been carrying for so long was gone. But just as the judge was about to dismiss the court, something unexpected happened. The lead detective stood and approached the judge, whispering something in his ear. The judge frowned and nodded. "Before we conclude," the judge said, "I've been informed that an arrest warrant has just been issued for another individual in connection with this case. This person is currently being detained and will face charges shortly." The tension in the room spiked again. Jamal turned to Mr. Carter, who looked equally surprised. "Who is it?" Jamal whispered. Mr. Carter didn't have to answer. The doors opened, and two officers walked in, escorting someone in handcuffs. Jamal's jaw dropped as he saw who it was, Marcus. The courtroom erupted into chaos once more. Marcus kept his head down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Jamal felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. How could this be? Marcus had testified in his defense. He had claimed to be helping him. As the officers led Marcus away, Jamal's mind raced with questions. Had Marcus lied on the stand? Was his testimony part of some twisted plan to save himself? Or was there something even deeper at play? The judge banged his gavel one final time, dismissing the court. As Jamo stepped outside into the sunlight, the cameras and microphones swarmed him, but he ignored them. The trial was over, but the truth? The truth was still unraveling, one layer at a time.